So thanks very much, everybody, for joining me today. I'm going to talk about historical fire return intervals and how fire shaped forest development across the east side of the Mount Hood National Forest. I'm going to start in the Oregon white oak forest and dry mixed conifer forest, and then move all the way up into the high elevation zone today. So the first part of it will really be a focus on oaks, and then we'll move up into how those fires in the oak zone did or did not move up into the higher elevations. I want to acknowledge that I'm doing this work with a lot of great people. Micah, Sven, Kiala, James, and Anna have put in a lot of work on this project, both in the field and in the lab, and then helping prepare results. So a little bit about the work we do. As Mary was saying, we're dendroecologists. That means we take tree rings and use them to develop a refined understanding of how forests develop over time and mature in old growth stands, or in some cases how they don't. It's a really big deal to us to share the information we're developing with groups like the Oaks Partnership, forest collaboratives, and watershed councils, so that people who are interested in doing restoration can have this data as it develops and have a shared understanding of it. Yeah, so just some photos of us on a field trip at one of these oak sites that I'm going to go over today on the east side of the Mount Hood. Reason for this research in this study area. First reason, a lot of you guys are aware of the effects fire exclusion has had, is particularly in the drier forests. In this photo, you're seeing an oak that developed in a pretty open stand and had an open growth structure, and now it's been surrounded and overtopped by Douglas fir during the period of fire exclusion. Another common thing we have across the study area is the high grading of our older and fire-resistant Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. These trees survive lots of fire. They're very insect and disease resistant, but in a lot of cases, we remove them out. In many cases, we think of this as something in the drier forest in the pine zone where ponderosa pine was being removed selectively, but it's also really common in the higher elevation forest to see areas where the old growth Douglas fir have been selected out of the cool, wet stands. The other part we have going on is a lot of plantations across the landscape that have a structure that's much more uniform, much more dense, and it's less complex in terms of tree composition and then forest structure. So we have a lot of plantations. So there's lots of reasons why we're interested in understanding how forests looked historically and how fire shaped those forests and how they'd be structured and resilient to fire in the future. So our research goals, before I really talk through those, don't look at the text right now. I just want to look at the map on the left and explain our study design. This is basically showing you the the Barlow Ranger District, which is on the east side of the Mount Hood National Forest. Mount Hood is just cut off here on the left side of this map. The little white circles with the black dots in them represent our study sites. There's 18 of them, and they're spaced every 10 kilometers. So our study, again, is starting in the dry oak pine systems, and then it's moving all the way up through the moist mixed conifer zone and into our high elevation western hemlock and silver forest. So it's covering a really broad gradient of forest types. What we want to do across those forest types is develop records of historical fire years and do this in a very precise way that allows us to quantify how frequent fire was in different forest types and their biophysical settings. When we do that, using this gridded setup, we can get a better understanding of how big fires were historically and how they moved across the study area. So again, that's saying when we had fire in the lower elevation drier forest, how often did they move into the upper elevation forest, and perhaps where did they stop? Using our data sets, we can also learn about how fires relate to climate and understand under what conditions we might have really big fire years going forward. And finally, we're interested in identifying where stand replacing fire effects were a really important part of forest development. So that's the high severity end of fire. How often did it happen, and in which of these different forest types is it more common? Before I go into the actual data for this study, I want to make you guys aware of some of the processes we're using in this research. The first one is really important, and that's cross-dating. Cross-dating is a technique we use to make sure we're assigning every tree ring on every sample we collect in this study to the precise calendar year in which it formed. And we're able to do this using the climatic sensitivity of tree growth to climate, which in other words means thin rings are going to form in warm, dry years, and fat rings are going to form in cool, moist years. And all trees are going to express the same climate signal across the study area. And this makes what's a fingerprint or a barcode in every chunk of wood we sample. And so by memorizing this fingerprint and measuring it in the lab, we can make sure we're absolutely finding the exact year of each fire and tree establishment date. So I have an example of this from Central Oregon on the right here. This dot here on the left is showing you the year 1760 on a tree core, and the two dots on the right are showing the year 1750. And if you move backwards in time from 1760, you'll see that 1757 in each one of these tree cores is a very thin year that formed in a really widespread and severe drought in 1757. So in summary, every single decade has its marker years, and by knowing those marker years and measuring them in the lab, we're able to make sure everything is dated correctly. The next thing I want you to be informed about is fire scars. A lot of people are aware that trees, when they're in a fire but they're not killed by the fire, often record that fire as a cambial scar. But there's some pretty important characteristics of scars that we pay attention to. This photo on the left, I'm showing you a fire-scarred ponderosa pine that was scarred by a fire when it was 8 years old. And that's on the top side of this little circle here. You'll see that there's no more rings there. And what happened was that that fire burned at low severity through the stand. It heated through the bark. It didn't physically burn the tree, but it heated through the bark and it killed the cambium just right here on this tree. And it left a dead spot on the tree cylinder right there. You'll notice that that wound is very clean. The wound doesn't go across rings, and that's what we know makes it a fire scar. Other types of injuries to trees will be much messier and they move across rings. The reason why fire scars are so clean is because it's actually formed by heating through the bark and not physical damage of the tree. So this ponderosa pine here recorded several fire scars, one when it was 8, another one 5 years later, and then another fire several years later. So that's what we're using to reconstruct historical fire events. As you see on the joke there, they're looking at a fire scar on a log there. And as I mentioned earlier, we're cross-dating all of our samples. And in the past, in a lot of our moist forests across the Pacific Northwest, people have noted fire scars, but studies haven't actually cross-dated them and figured out exactly when they happen. And what that's led to is a lack of understanding of how frequent fires were and how extensive they were. So if you see a fire scar and you don't know the exact year it formed, you can't know if that's the same fire at the next plot. Similarly, if I have 2 trees at a site and they each record 3 fires, I don't know if those are the same 3 fires or if they represent 6 different fires. So by cross-dating, we're really able to develop a great record of how frequent fire occurred across multiple centuries. So just a few photos of what this process looks like in this study. In these photos, Anna and I are excavating stumps in the field. You dig them out, clean them up, and you get low, and you can actually find solid wood that includes tree establishment dates and fire scars from stumps that have been logged several decades ago. So just some photos of that. And here's what some of these fire scars look like in the field. This sample on the left is recording a fire right after the tree was established, and then 3 subsequent fires. You can see these nice big clear fire scars on that sample. After we get the samples from the field study sites, we take them to our shop and we run them across a joiner, sometimes through a planer. And this process progressively smooths the sample and lets us see the fire scars and the tree rings much more clearly. So this here is a sample we took out of an Oregon white oak stand with a little bit of Douglas fir. This is how it looked in the field. And then once we've sanded it and polished it up, now you can really see the different fire scars that are recorded on this tree clearly. This is the end stage of the process. So this is a fire scar that's been sanded and then cross-dated. And now we've applied the exact calendar years to it. So in this example, these 3 dots that I'm pointing at right now correspond to the year 1700. We put 3 dots in a century. Every decade gets a single dot, and then a half century gets 2 dots. So this sample is showing you a fire scar in 1751, a fire in 1729, 1710, and so forth. So this is the basic data piece we're using to reconstruct fires across the study area. I'm almost ready now to launch into the results. But before I do that, I want to explain the different symbol types you're going to see on the graphs for each of the study sites. There's 3 pieces of data we're interested in looking at on these graphs. The first is the tree's establishment year. So that's going to be the pith, or the very first ring that the tree formed. That represents the year it was established in the stand. The next thing we're interested in are the different fire scars. In this case, you're seeing a fire scar on a Douglas fir in 1659. And that's going to be represented on graphs by red vertical tick marks. And finally, we show a timeline that's going to extend from the outermost ring on the tree sample to the innermost year. So we've got lines for the timeline, red vertical tick marks for the fire years, and then black circles for establishment years. So now I'm going to move into some results across this transect in the study area, going from our oak sites all the way up to the high elevation forests. So just some photos of the first site here. This is site 30. It's actually really close to the White River wildlife area that we just learned more about. And we're going to go through the historical fire return interval at this site. As you're seeing, I don't have a lot of pictures that show an open oak forest. This is a sort of a poster child of a site that had the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that were old and large, high-graded out of it, and then it underwent over a century of fire exclusion, and it's pretty dense now. I did get a shot of mica outside of this site in an area that had been recently treated. So just a few more photos of what it looks like today. And now finally into the results. So this graph here that I'm showing you is a little bit complicated. The bottom axis is time, and so this is showing you the year 1450 to 2000. Each tree that we sampled at the site that we've dated right now has its own timeline, and then these red vertical tick marks are the fire years. What I want you to notice here is that there's a whole bunch of red vertical tick marks, and they line up across samples. So for example, this fire in 1710 is recorded on 4 different trees at the site. Fire in 1724 is recorded on 3 different trees in the site. Most trees don't record all fires that burn across them. That's why we're sampling lots of trees, so we can develop a full record for the small area we're sampling of fires that burn through the stand. So what you see here is extremely frequent fire occurring at a 6-year fire return interval through what was historically a multi-aged and open woodland structure. There's an incredible record at this site. We have tree rings going back to the 13th century, and one sample doing a really good job of recording fire all the way back to the late 1400s. So fire was happening historically at about every 6 years, and then right around 1870, fire started to slow down. So we went 18 years without a fire, and then after 1888, there were no more fires at this site. So it's had more than 130 years without its regular historical repeated fire cycle. I'm going to move now to another Oregon white oak and dry mixed conifer site. This is site 15. It's 20 kilometers directly north. It's just to the west of the town of Dufur. Very similar sort of biophysical environment, a dry site around 20 inches of annual precip. And historically, it had a 6-year fire return interval. So we didn't get as long as a fire record at this site, but remarkably similar in the pace at which fire tended this site historically. So sites are really far apart, but really similar in frequency there. And I think what we have is a grass fire system here, where fire burns through fuels after they accumulate over a period of about 5 or 6 years, and then that fuel is removed, and then the fuel comes back and it burns again. So there's always good conditions for burning at these sites, and you're simply waiting for the fuels to recover before they burned again historically. One interesting thing that I wanted to point out about this site is it's actually had some fire in the past 4 decades. So this site had thinning and prescribed fire in 2010. It also had a wildfire in 1993, and we actually picked up some fires in 1984 and 1972. So this sort of contrasts with a lot of the sites, but it's nice to sort of randomly put out sites and see the evidence of fire reintroduction and thinning in some of these sites, and this site's sort of approaching having its fire return interval returned, even if it's a relatively small area of this forest type. I'm now going to move on to moist mixed conifer forests. We're going to take a really big change in biophysical setting. The last site we were at 23 inches of precip. This site gets 47 inches of precip. Quite a bit of that as snow. So we're at a higher elevation. We're much farther west, closer to Mount Hood. It's double the precip, and you'll see that reflected in the composition of this forest. It's much more diverse. You've got Douglas fir, grand fir, western larch, occasional ponderosa pine, noble fir in some cases, and lodgepole pine. So a much more diverse forest composition at this site that reflects that added moisture in, but we still see a lot of our fire adapted species on this site. Those being Douglas fir and ponderosa pine and western larch as the more fire resistant species. So a couple shots of what this particular sample site looks like today. And now into the results. So again, this is a timeline showing the trees that we've sampled and dated at the site. At this site, we were able to get a lot more pith dates because they weren't rotten. And what you can see as you look towards right about the year 1650 on this graph, you can see that there's not a lot of trees that predate the tree established in 1659. There's only one. And there's a cluster of trees establishing in that period after 1650. I think what occurred at this fire is it probably burned at higher severity, close to a stand replacing fire sometime in the 1650s. It then reburned in 1683. And so you have sort of 2 cohorts coming into this site, one following a high severity fire and one following a reburn. As we move into higher elevation sites, we often find that pattern that they have a stand initiation fire followed by reburns, and then they develop a multi-age structure over time because of that. We've taken a couple different groups to this type of environmental setting, and most of the time people are surprised to see that we're finding 3 to 4 fires per century at this site. The historical fire return intervals somewhere around 25 to 33 years. And you know, in our literature values for a site like this, it's usually somewhere around 75 or greater than 100 years, depending on what you're looking at. But a big takeaway here is that the old growth forest on this site developed with following a stand replacing fire, but also with low and moderate severity fire thereafter. So old growth at this site develops with chronic low and moderate severity fire, not in the absence of it. I do think that we probably missed a couple fire years at this site. And sort of the site I want to get back to and cut some more cross sections. To wrap up, I'm going to move up to our high elevation, cool and wet forests. We're now in the silver fir and western hemlock zone. We've added a lot more of those 2 species. Ponderosa pine drops out unless in this case it's been planted in a plantation in the foreground of this photo. But our major species are Douglas fir, a lot of grand fir, western white pine, western larch, and occasional noble fir and silver fir mixed in. So just a few photos of that. This site that I'm showing you here is the site I'm going to give you the fire history for. It actually had Engelmann spruce, silver fir, and grand fir as the most common trees. And then historically, it had a lot of large old growth Douglas fir that were cut out of the site. So now the report for a high elevation, cool and wet forest. This site had 2 to 4 fires per century. We see what's a really clear cohort to me established again after a fire event sometime in the 1650s. That's actually consistent with the site that I just was reporting results for. These sites are 10 kilometers apart, but they're next to each other in the study area. So we see, evidence of a stand replacing or near stand replacing fire sometime in 1650. And then we see another burn in 1692, 1752, 1784, 1814, 1840, 1868, and 1889. This site was pretty surprising to me. We were usually finding somewhere around 1 to 2 fire scars per cross section that we were sampling. And I thought we're only going to get 1 to 2 fires out of the site, but we actually found 4 fires in the 1800s alone, which shows that this site in some centuries burned quite frequently, about every 25 years. And we have less evidence of fire in the 1700s. It's another site that I think we might go sample some more at to see if there was more fire that we missed at this site. But again, I think this is surprising in that the fire frequency is not nearly as frequent as it is in a dry mixed conifer system, but you're still getting quite a bit of fire as this stand developed after its stand replacing event. So 2 to 4 fires per century here with good evidence of a stand replacing fire in the 1650s. So I'm going to just finish up highlighting some preliminary findings. Oregon white oak sites burn very frequently before fire exclusion, somewhere between 15 to 20 times per century. Our moist mixed conifer and high elevation forest sites burned 3 to 4 times per century, quite a bit more than our literature values would suggest. And a final point I want to mention for all these different forest types is that low and moderate severity fire effects were important to the development of old growth forests. Another way to say that is old growth within this study landscape developed with fire, not in the absence of fire. So often we think of these moist old forests being places that aren't disturbed by fire regularly, but they were, and that was part of how they developed their structure and composition and managed to persist to become old growth. I want to acknowledge Riley and Skylar who've been helping us out with this. Several different, the Wasco County Collaborative, the Hood River Collaborative, the Barlow Ranger District, ODF, and OSU. And I'm really happy to take questions, but I feel like I should throw in one extra slide here. Taking a quick break here. Just look at the top slide. This is showing you the fires at each of the sites I just went over. So the bottom 2 sites, 13 and 14, those are the cool moist sites. 15 and 30 are the oak pine sites. And so 15 and 30, you see this much higher frequency of fire happening about every 6 years. At 14 and 13, I want you to look at those 2 sites and look at the similarity in fire events. So they both burned in 1840, they both burned in 1783, and they both burned in 1752. And I think what that's showing us is that those cooler, moist mixed conifer and high elevation forests tend to burn in larger fires that were really big. So probably during more severe fire weather and drought, and those fires were pretty big. As we add to this study, it'll be real interesting to see, if it's the bigger fire events that are tending those higher elevation forests. But you can sort of see on this last graph the difference in frequency between the oak pine sites on the top, and then sort of the similarity between sites 14 and 13 that are in the cool weather forests. So I think I went way too fast, but I think that's good for the schedule. I'm happy to take questions from people.